Have you ever felt that the love you gave turned to contempt? Inside the house that was supposed to be your refuge? I felt it. And it wasn't in a moment of tension or argument. It was an ordinary morning after breakfast, when I just wanted to wash some clothes that had piled up. Nothing major. Clothes I'd worn myself, my granddaughter's clothes that had fallen into the dirt the day before, a sheet that smelled like it had been stored away. I calmly went to the laundry room, as I always did, and began to carefully sort everything. But as soon as I leaned against the machine, I heard a dry voice behind me. It was my daughter-in-law. She didn't even wait for me to finish adding the soap. "You're disrupting the flow of the laundry. Better to wash by hand, okay?" was what she said. In a polite tone, the kind that cuts through more than a shout. I stopped. I looked at her, then at the typewriter. My hands were shaking a little. And it wasn't from age. It was from shame. From the feeling of treading on territory where I was no longer welcome. It was my son's home, but there, I felt like I had no home at all. Have you ever been there? Have you ever felt like no matter how much you gave, how much you sacrificed, there comes a time when people simply forget who you were, and treat you like your leftovers? We raise children, weather storms, give up on dreams, only to hear at the end of our lives that we're disrupting the flow of the laundry. It may seem like a small thing to outsiders, but to those who live it, it's a sentence. It's as if you're being placed in the place of discomfort, of excess, of the old thing no one wants around anymore. At that moment, I didn't cry. I didn't fight back. I just lowered my eyes and gathered the clothes, one by one, with the same care as always. And I took them all to the sink. I, over 80 years old, washing clothes in the sink as if I were back in my 20s, when I lived somewhere without electricity. The difference is that back then I had a living husband, dreams in my heart, and small children running around in the yard. Now, I had a bucket, an uncomfortable silence, and the sound of laughter coming from the living room. I knew my presence there was disturbing, not out of overt malice, but out of that indifference that hurts more than words. You know when you walk through the living room and no one looks up? When your opinion isn't even asked about dinner? When all you do is babysit your granddaughter or fold towels that no one wants to put away? I became that. A piece of furniture that moves slowly. But even so, I stayed there. Because we always hope for a look to change, for a gesture of affection to return, for someone to suddenly remember everything you did and say, thank you. But that thank you never came. Not that day. Not after. And that's why I say, in that moment, as I scrubbed clothes in the sink with my hands full of soap and my heart full of shame, something inside me changed. Quietly. But profoundly. But to understand how I got to this point, you need to go back in time with me. Because before all this happened, there was a story. A story of love, of struggle, of sacrifice. A real and painfully common story of many grandmothers like me. My name is Lily, and I'm from rural Georgia. I grew up surrounded by sewing threads, the smell of baking cakes, and the silence after sunset. I was taught from an early age that life wouldn't hand me anything on a silver platter. But I was also taught that if I did everything with love, perhaps the reward would come later. So that's what I did. I married young, at 19, to a simple but kind-hearted man. We had 2 children, and for a while, I thought my world was complete. But life doesn't care about plans. When my husband died in a truck accident, I wasn't even 40. And that's when my true journey began. I didn't have time to cry properly. I had 2 boys to feed and bills due before they could even be paid. The only thing I knew how to do well was sewing. So that's what saved me. I turned our living room into a makeshift studio. I spent nights sewing church dresses, mending pants, embroidering pillowcases to sell at the market. And even on the days I passed out on the couch from exhaustion, I never let them go without food. Or love. Love was always in abundance. It's curious how we remember the details when we look back. The lunchboxes I wrapped with little notes, the times I sold my watch to pay for the school trip, the birthdays I celebrated with cornmeal cake and soda divided into colorful cups. It wasn't luxury, but it was made with everything I had. I always believed my children would grow up knowing that, even with little, they were rich in affection, in presence, in truth. And for a long time, I thought they knew. That they would carry this in their hearts. That they would never forget. But the years passed. And with them came a transformation I didn't immediately notice. The sweet boy who hugged me tightly when I came home from school became a busy man, always in a hurry. My daughter-in-law arrived as if asking permission, but soon took over the spaces, the schedules, the decisions. And I, who was once the center of the house, became a backdrop. You know when you realize your opinion no longer matters? That your advice is heard with that hurried, aha, while people check their phones? It's subtle, but it gradually erases you from within. There was a time when my grandson asked why I lived with them. His mother replied, because she has nowhere else to go. That hit me hard. Because the hidden truth behind that sentence is cruel. It's not just about physical space. It's about belonging. About being seen. About being remembered not as an obligation, but as a choice. I wasn't there out of convenience. I was there because I thought I could still add value, that I still had something to offer. But in that moment, I understood that, to them, I was just a burden to be managed. And that's why, when that laundry scene happened, it wasn't an isolated shock. It was the culmination of a series of small rejections that had been accumulating over the years. A dish left for me to wash alone. A forgotten Christmas present. A "we'll see later" that never became now. That day only exposed what I already knew but avoided accepting. I had become invisible within my own family. The feeling was of being alive, but forgotten. Breathing, but ignored. It's as if I existed only in the background of their lives. Cooking dinner while they watched television. Collecting clothes from the clothesline while laughing at videos on their phones. I was useful, but unloved. Present, but unseen. And it corrodes. Slowly but deeply. It takes away the sparkle in your eyes, the desire to talk, even the pleasure of waking up. You start to live in order to not disturb. To not bother. To not be noticed. Because being noticed can mean being discarded. But even so, I was still there. Maybe out of fear. Maybe out of attachment. Or maybe because I still believed everything could change. That all it took was a sincere conversation, a gesture of affection, a "Mom, we love you." But that gesture never came. And little by little, I came to accept that it wouldn't come. But life sometimes has a strange way of showing us what needs to be done. Not through advice or divine revelation, but through pain. That silent pain that wakes you up on a Sunday morning and makes you see clearly everything you've been avoiding. And that Sunday I saw it. And that's when, without saying a word, I started planning something. Not for revenge, but for dignity. Because when you realize you're no longer welcome, the greatest proof of love you can give yourself. But I still clung to the hope that it was just my imagination. Because that's how we protect ourselves. The mind, even wounded, makes excuses to not accept rejection. They're just stressed with work. She didn't mean to be rude, it was just a way of putting it. Time is running out, that's why no one talks anymore. I repeated these phrases to myself like someone reciting prayers, not because I believed them, but because I needed to believe them. When I moved in with my son, I thought it would be for a few months. An adjustment. A breather. I was going through a difficult period, with my health fluctuating, and he himself had said, "Come here, Mom. You'll be fine here." And at first, it seemed that way. They gave me a room at the end of the hall, bought a new blanket, and made me tea the first night. But what began as care turned into tolerance. And from tolerance came discomfort. It's subtle, you know? It's not shouting, nor direct insults. It's the long silences at the dinner table. The impatient glances when you try to tell a story from the past. The heavy sighs when you ask how to work the remote. The way they look at each other when you spill a glass of water. It's the kind of contempt that doesn't need words, because it's in the gestures, the tone, behind the scenes of every interaction. I saw this happen, day after day. At first, they'd offer me coffee. Then, it was just a, if you want it, it's in the bottle. Before that, they'd invite me to watch a movie together. Then, they started using headphones. Little by little, I realized that my presence was making the atmosphere heavier. Not because of anything I said or did, but simply by being there. As if I occupied a space no one else knew how to fill. As if my existence caused a discomfort that everyone tried to disguise, but none of them could truly hide. And yet, I was trying to fit in. I helped in the kitchen, folded clothes, cleaned what was already clean. Anything to be useful. Because for us mothers and grandmothers, being useful is almost a way of apologizing for still being alive. It's as if we're saying, look, I'm still good for something, please don't throw me away. But the impact of loneliness isn't just about being alone. It's about feeling invisible even when surrounded by people. Have you ever felt this? Being in a room full of voices, but none directed at you? Eating in silence while everyone talks about things you no longer understand? And worst of all, realizing that no one makes an effort to include you. It's a hidden truth that no one talks about, but many of us live. A pain that doesn't scream, but sickens inside. There was one moment in particular that struck me. I was in the kitchen, chopping vegetables, and I heard my daughter-in-law say to my son, unaware that I was listening, "We need to think about what to do with your mother. This isn't a nursing home." It tore me apart. What are you going to do with your mother? As if I were a problem, a piece of furniture out of place, something that needed to be fixed. In that instant, the ground disappeared beneath my feet. Because it wasn't just about physical space. It was about the broken bond. The emotional disconnect. The coldness of someone who once looked at you with love, and now doesn't look at you at all. Still, I continued to pretend I hadn't heard. I kept smiling. I kept washing the dishes. Because that's what we do when we're emotionally wounded. We try to maintain our routine so we don't fall apart. But inside, a silent transformation was already taking place. My mindset, which had previously been one of hope, began to shift to one of resistance. Of survival. I began to see everything differently. The details I'd previously ignored now had meaning. The lack of hugs. The absence of, good morning. The bedroom door closing whenever I approached. The grumpy old lady, jokes my granddaughter repeated without even knowing what she was saying. These were signs. Small, but consistent. Signs of devaluation that only those who've been there can recognize. And it's curious how loneliness can be so loud when you're the only one listening. I began to listen to my own pain more closely. To reflect on everything I'd silently accepted. Everything I'd kept quiet for fear of being a burden. And for the first time in a long time, I asked myself a question I'd been avoiding for years. What if I don't deserve this? What if I still have the right to be happy? That question didn't bring me an immediate answer. But it opened a door. A crack of courage. And it was through it that I began to peer into what lay beyond that house. Because maybe, just maybe, my story wasn't over yet. I remember that day as if it were now. It was cold, cloudy, and the sky felt as heavy as my chest. I woke to a sweet smell coming from the kitchen, and soon afterward my daughter-in-law entered the room with a tray in her hands. "I brought coffee, ma'am, you need more rest," she said with a practiced smile. I sat up slowly, adjusted the pillow behind my back, and thanked her, surprised. Such a gesture was rare. Warm. Caring. Almost maternal. It shattered me inside. I felt as if, for a moment, someone had remembered I existed. That I was still someone there. I smiled back, trying to hold back the lump in my throat. And for a few minutes, I was foolish enough to believe things were changing. That perhaps, after so much silence and invisibility, they were finally seeing me again. As a person. As a mother. As a woman. As someone who dedicated her entire life to giving, serving, protecting. But illusions are short-lived. And that hot coffee, served with kindness, wasn't the beginning of a reconciliation. It was a rehearsal for something very different. Later, I went to the laundromat to do the laundry. I always enjoyed doing it. It gave me a sense of purpose. It was as if each item washed was a reminder that I could still contribute, still be a part of something. But when I got there, I found the door locked. Just like that. No sign. No entry. Just locked. Outside, a bucket, soap, and piled up clothes. I stood there for a few seconds, as if searching for an explanation in the air. I tried to open it again. I carefully forced the doorknob, as if the gesture could change reality. But it was locked. And in the silence of that hallway, I understood everything. That breakfast wasn't a treat. It was a message disguised as care. And the bucket there on the floor, almost like an emotional trap, showed me exactly where I belonged. In that instant, the impact didn't come as a scream, nor as anger. It came as an emptiness. As if something inside me had been disconnected. I didn't cry. I didn't bang on the door. I just took a deep breath, grabbed the bucket, and went to the sink. I washed each item in silence, like someone performing a farewell ritual. Have you ever experienced this kind of silent revelation? The one that doesn't need words to break you? These are the ones that hurt the most. Because they're cold, calculated, and behind the apparent normality, they carry the hidden truth that you're no longer welcome. And it's not said with blatant cruelty. Worse, it's done politely. With smiles. With, "so you can rest." As if they were politely erasing you. As if, instead of expelling you, they were simply redirecting you to a corner where no one else needs to bother. From then on, what had been silence turned to contempt. Small changes began to happen. They stopped inviting me out to lunch. Conversations began to take place in another room. Family decisions were made without me present. And the house, which had once felt like shelter, became an emotional minefield. I treaded carefully, avoided noise, and lowered my voice. I was afraid of being noticed. Afraid of disturbing others. And this, for a woman who spent her life being the pillar of her family, is a kind of humiliation difficult to explain. The cruelest thing was that everything happened surreptitiously. No one said outright that I was no longer needed. But the feeling was clear. They were pushing me to the margins. Slowly erasing me. And worst of all, they disguised it as care. "You've already done too much. Now it's time to rest. You don't need to worry about anything." Beautiful phrases, but when said incorrectly, with the right intonation, they take on a different meaning. Because they don't speak of gratitude. They speak of estrangement. Of exile. And it's at this point that vulnerability starts to turn into anger. Not an explosive anger that screams and breaks everything. But the silent kind. The kind that brews inside. That wakes up with you and stays with you until the end of the day. Because you realize you've spent your whole life building something, and now you're treated like a misplaced piece. As if your story had ended without a final chapter. But I'm not a piece out of place. I'm the whole place. I was the foundation. I was the base. I was the one who held it all together when no one else could. And no matter how much they tried to silence me with polite gestures, there was something inside me that wouldn't shut up anymore. I started listening to myself again. I started revisiting everything I'd experienced. The losses. The choices. The behind the scenes of every decision that brought me here. And for the first time in a long time, I looked at myself not as an old woman, but as a whole woman, who still had the right to dignity. To be heard. To be present. This change didn't come from outside. It came from within. It was a transformation of mindset. A break with passivity. Because when you understand that silence isn't peace, but rather erasure, something has to change. And when I understood this, my journey took a turn no one expected. That's when the worst happened. Not with shouting. Not with fighting. But with those rules that arrive slowly, disguised as organization. Disguised as care. First it was the television. You can watch, of course. Just try not to change the channels, okay? Clarinia gets irritated when they change. Then it was the refrigerator. If you're going to get something at night, let me know in advance. The noise from the door is bothersome. And then came others. Avoid leaving your room too early. Don't use the upstairs bathroom. Guests might arrive. Don't stay in the backyard for too long. The neighbors will comment. They were small orders, spoken with a smile, but each one left an invisible cut. And the accumulation of those cuts, that's what hurts more than any blow. Patricia, my daughter-in-law, became the guardian of what was allowed and what wasn't. And everything that came from her seemed to be law. I was the only one who had to ask permission for everything, as if living in that house were a favor granted to me, not a right built over a lifetime of sacrifice. What hurt most was seeing Renato, my own son, pretending not to understand. He saw it. I know he saw it. But he said nothing. Maybe out of fear of confrontation. Maybe out of convenience. Maybe out of shame. I don't know. But every time he fell silent, he also said something to me. He said, "I let this happen." And when a child allows their mother to be silenced, something inside us breaks. It's as if the bond that connected you to the idea of family begins to rot. You begin to see the world through a new lens. Not that of a proud mother, who did everything for her children and is content with little, but that of someone trapped in a narrative constructed by others, where you can only exist if you quietly follow all the rules. The house was big, but for me, it was shrinking. My world shrank to my bedroom and laundry area. Places where I could exist uninterrupted, without stepping on invisible toes. Clarinia, my granddaughter, was the only thread of affection I had left. But even she became shielded. That doesn't bother the girl, she needs to rest. She's studying, don't get in the way. The girl looked at me tenderly, sometimes coming to give me a quick hug, but always with that care, as if she were breaking some rule just because she liked me. I noticed everything. And I began to observe the behind the scenes of that house more closely. The way they whispered when I left the room. The doors slammed shut as I approached. The glances that averted themselves when I entered the living room. I began to understand that the isolation wasn't accidental. It was constructed. And it wasn't meant to protect me. It was meant to erase me. This hidden truth began to take hold of me. And with it came a silent transformation. Not the kind that explodes, but the kind that ripens like a forgotten fruit on the tree. I found myself inside a kind of emotional prison, where the cell has no bars, but does have rules. Where you're not handcuffed, but conditioned. And there's no lock more cruel than the one that convinces you you can no longer speak, nor exist as before. Decisions were made. I wasn't consulted on anything. From choosing lunch to home renovations. And when I did venture an opinion, I'd get a yes, of course, which was quickly forgotten. I could live there, as long as I didn't interfere. My job was to be discreet, obedient, and silent. I was part of the decor. A tolerated presence, as long as I didn't take up too much space. And in this routine of cordial exclusion, I began to lose myself. My desires began to fade. My sense of identity faded, like a slowly flickering light. I looked in the mirror and no longer recognized who I was. Where had that strong woman gone, who raised 2 children alone, who sewed until her fingers bled to ensure a better future? Where was Lily, who laughed out loud, who danced in the kitchen, who told stories on warm summer nights? She seemed to have remained long ago, in a time when love wasn't conditioned by rules. But all that emotional fog gradually began to dissipate. And what surfaced was something even I hadn't expected. A new lucidity. A kind of clarity that only comes after much silence. I began to understand that I wasn't weak for feeling pain, nor ungrateful for desiring respect, nor crazy for wanting to be heard. I was human. And what I was experiencing was violence disguised as coexistence. A toxic routine, camouflaged as stability. It was at this point in the journey that transformation became necessity. And when necessity meets courage, decisions are born. Not from impulsiveness, but from conscience. I didn't want revenge. I wanted peace. I didn't want confrontation. But I needed to rediscover the woman I once was, and who, somehow, still lived within me. And it was then that, silently, I began to act. Small actions. Almost invisible movements. But which, deep inside, carried the weight of an imminent liberation. Because when a woman who has been silenced for so long begins to listen to herself again, the world around her is unprepared for what comes next. That night, I washed my hands. But it wasn't just clothes. There was something about that simple gesture, of placing my hands in the cold water, that pierced me completely. It was as if each stroke of soap, each friction of the fabric, took with it a piece of the dignity I still tried to maintain. The bucket, the water, the stone tank, all of it transported me to an ancient time, but not with nostalgia. It was with contained revolt. Because in that moment, I understood that I wasn't an old lady washing her clothes. I was a woman being put in her proper place, as if needing to be reminded that she no longer had the right to comfort or respect. The sentence still echoed in my head like an unspoken slap. You mess everything up and take too long, Lily. Go wash your clothes by hand. This isn't a hotel. She said it with a smirk at the corner of her mouth, holding her cell phone and absent-mindedly fiddling with something unimportant. Patricia didn't scream. She struck silently, like someone shooting without making a sound. And the worst part was the audience. Clarinia, my granddaughter, was there. She heard everything. And remained silent. I don't blame the girl. Children learn by example. And when the example they have is their grandmother being ignored, scolded, and pushed away, they accept it as normal. That cut me to the quick. Seeing my granddaughter lower her eyes, unsure of what to do, lacking the courage to stand up for me. It was like feeling my story being erased right before my eyes. Because it's not just about doing laundry. It's about being diminished in front of those who should look up to me with admiration. As I scrubbed the cloths in the sink, my mind wandered. I remembered the times I spent nights sewing baby clothes for Clarinia, while she was still in my belly. The times I rocked her to sleep in my arms while singing softly, afraid of waking her parents. I remembered the affection, the sweetness with which she called me Grandma Lily when she was little. Where had all that gone? At what point did I stop being the caring grandmother and become nothing more than a nuisance to be controlled? The impact of that scene was profound, but not immediate. It festered within me, growing inside. Public humiliation has a strange power. It exposes you, but it also reveals you. Because when you're pushed to the edge of your dignity, you either break, or you awaken. And that's what happened to me that night. I awakened. A decision was quietly being born within me. It wasn't a decision for revenge. It was one of reconstruction, of redemption. Because no one should get used to being invisible. No one should accept disrespect disguised as routine. I'd spent my life thinking my worth came from what I did for others. But in that moment, between one bucket and the next, I realized my worth no longer depended on anyone's approval. That tank, that cold water, those clothes. Everything there became a symbol. A kind of closing ritual. It was as if each item washed was a memory I was rinsing away. A pain I was releasing. A version of myself I was finally leaving behind. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying my journey like someone watching a movie. I saw scenes from the past. The wedding, my husband's funeral, my children's simple birthdays, the firm scoldings, the tight hugs, the I love yous, never said but always expressed. I also saw the more recent silences, the sidelong glances, the dinners where no one asked me anything. This entire timeline flashed before me with absurd clarity. And it was in that moment of vigilance that I made a decision. If I was going to stay there, in that house, it would have to be on new terms. And if those new terms weren't possible, then I would need to find another path. I still didn't know exactly what I would do. But I knew I wouldn't accept it anymore. I didn't have the strength to fight. But I had the strength to leave. I had enough courage to start over, even with wrinkled hands, even with a tired body. The next day, I woke up early. I made coffee as usual, tidied the kitchen, washed the dishes they'd left scattered around, more out of habit than obligation. But this time, something was different. I no longer did it out of fear of being frowned upon. I did it because I am careful, attentive, strong. And no one could take that away from me. Patricia's look, when she saw me sitting on the porch writing in my notebook, was different too. She found it strange. Perhaps she sensed something had changed. Because, for the first time in a long time, I stood up straight. My chin lifted. My eyes steady. It wasn't arrogance. It was presence. It was the woman she thought she had silenced, rising up, inside. Renato, as always, pretended not to see. But I saw. I saw everything. Because when we wake from emotional anesthesia, lucidity is painful, but also liberating. And there, with pen in hand and the window open, I began to write something I'd never had the courage to say out loud. I began to write about what I had become, and about who I wanted to be again. Because what I lost in that house, I would only recover far from it. I started writing about what I had become, and who I wanted to be again. Because what I lost in that house, I would only recover away from it. As the pen scratched the paper, I felt a slight tremor in my hands. It wasn't weakness. It was pent-up emotion. Each written word was a release, a confession, a reunion with myself. And in the midst of that morning silence, I realized that this story, my story, wasn't just mine. How many women, how many grandmothers, how many mothers have gone through this? How many have been silenced by a, "It's only for a while. Don't make a fuss. You're the one who misunderstood." How many have remained silent, trying to maintain peace, only to end up at war with themselves? If anything in this story has upset you, leave your thoughts in the comments below. Sometimes, venting is the first step to freeing what's trapped inside. And when you write, you're not just releasing words. You're saying, "I exist, I feel, and this hurt me too." This space is for that. For those who've never had a place to share their side of the story, their pain, their truth. And if this content touched you in any way, if it triggered memories, or made you see something you previously avoided, like this video. Because every like helps this story reach more people who need to hear that they're not alone. There are many people going through the same thing, but thinking it's an exaggeration, that it's just getting older. And it's not. And if you feel like you need more stories like this, true, intense, emotional, subscribe to the channel. Because this channel isn't about numbers. It's about lives. It's about creating a space where silent pain can be heard, where muffled voices gain an echo. And it's you who makes that happen. Every comment, every like, every subscription is like an outstretched hand saying, "I understand, I'm here." Because sometimes all we need is someone to say, "What you experienced hurt me too." And when these voices meet, something powerful happens. Shame gives way to courage. Silence becomes strength. And what was invisible finally becomes visible. That day, I put the notebook away in the drawer, carefully closed the window, and stood there, breathing deeply, feeling the weight of the world on my shoulders, and the seed of change sprouting in my chest. I still didn't know exactly how I was going to do it. But I knew that, from then on, I wouldn't wash clothes in the sink anymore. Nor would I dirty my hands cleaning up anyone's neglect. Because when we understand our own worth, accepting crumbs is no longer an option. I went to a place where no one told me to shut up. It wasn't overnight. There was no shouting, no fuss. It was in the silence, the same silence that so often suffocated me, that I found my escape route. The difference is that, this time, silence was my ally. Because I no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. I just needed to go. It all began with small coins forgotten in my pockets. A little change here, another there. a favor done for a neighbor, an order for a dishcloth I secretly embroidered at night, under the dim light of a lamp. Those cloths, once used to dry dishes, began to dry my pain. And each stitch I embroidered was also a thread sewn into my courage. A trace of resistance. I was no longer doing things to please. I was doing things to build. Not a castle, but a way out. A chance. A beginning. I kept my money in an old tea box, hidden in the back of a drawer, among winter clothes no one else wore. And every time I opened that drawer, I saw something bigger than notes and coins. I saw choice, freedom, a plan, something uniquely mine. For the first time in a long time, there was a secret inside me that didn't hurt. On the contrary, it nourished me. It made me feel alive. On the days when the house's contempt seemed loudest, I took refuge in that silent plain. I didn't respond to provocations. I no longer explained myself. Because I knew what no one there knew. I was already leaving. I no longer felt part of that system. I no longer accepted the supporting role in my own life. And this shift in mindset changed everything. I could be there, physically present. But inside, I was already far away. It's funny how, when we change inside, the world around us seems unsure how to react. My daughter-in-law began to find my silence strange. Renato began to observe me more closely. I saw in his eyes an uneasiness that hadn't existed before. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was fear of losing control. But I wasn't there to confirm any of that. I was simply preparing to leave, with dignity, with strategy, with determination. The last straw came one Sunday afternoon. Clarinia was in the backyard and came to show me a drawing. Something simple, but full of color. She had drawn a house. On the door, she wrote my name. "It's Grandma Lily's house," she said. I looked at that sheet of paper with a tightness in my chest. Because, deep down, that was what I wanted. A place where my name was on the door. Where I wasn't a guest. Where I could exist without asking permission. Where I could breathe without measuring the volume of my sighs. That same night, I packed a small backpack. I only packed the essentials. Some clothes, documents, a notebook with old recipes, a photo of my husband, and the tea box with the money. I left the house silently, just as I'd lived there for so long. I didn't leave a note. I didn't slam the door. I didn't look back. I just left. But unlike the times I'd gone out to buy bread or hang out the laundry, this time there was no planned return. It was the end of a cycle. And I knew it. I went straight to Dona Matilda's house, a lady who lives 3 streets down. We'd already spoken a few times at the gate. She knew my pain. And one day, in a brief outburst, she said to me, "If you ever need shelter, my door is open." At the time, I thanked her out of politeness. But those words kept echoing. And now they made sense. She greeted me with a look of understanding without needing to ask. She offered me tea, lovingly prepared the sofa, and bluntly said, "Stay as long as you like." And on that worn sofa, in that modest living room, I felt a kind of welcome I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't about luxury. It was about presence. About listening. About humanity. It was there, in that small, unremarkable space, that I began to rebuild myself. I slept for the first time in months without fear of missing my shower time or disturbing others with footsteps. I woke to the sound of birds and not to disapproving glances. I made coffee the way I liked, calmly, listening to the kettle whistle. And I realized that, even with little, this was a place where I could be myself again. Freedom didn't come with celebration. It came with silence, with simplicity, with depth. But it was one of the most powerful feelings I've ever experienced. I was no longer the woman who washed clothes in the sink because she was forbidden to use it. I was the woman who chose not to accept that, who had the courage to go out with a backpack and an immense desire to live what was left of life with dignity. And the strangest thing is that, even after leaving that house, what weighed me down most wasn't what I left behind. It was what was holding me back. and what I still needed to face. Because leaving physically is just the beginning. The true new beginning lies in the mind. And it's within that mind that I still have many battles to win. Today I live in a back room of Dona Alice's house, an old friend from the fair days, one of those friendships that life separates, but that fate, sometimes out of mercy, sometimes out of justice, makes a point of reuniting at the right moment. Her house is simple, without luxury, with antique furniture and a backyard full of plants that grow somewhat haphazardly, but are full of life. And here, in this small, honest space, I rediscovered something I thought I'd lost: dignity. I have my own place, my own routine. I wake up early, make my own coffee with that scent that fills the kitchen with fond memories. I sew dishcloths, towels, and I've even started selling them again in the neighborhood. It's not much, but it's mine. I do everything in my own time, at my own pace, without anyone checking if I took too long to wash a dish or if I used the stove too much. Here, no one tells me to shut up. And that's precisely why, after so long, I started talking again. To myself, to God, to the world. Dona Alice treats me like a person. And this, which seems so simple, is what's most missing in the world. Sometimes she invites me for tea in the late afternoon, and we talk about nonsense, but also about life's wounds. She never asks me directly what happened, but listens to everything I slowly reveal. And just this listening space is a remedy. Because the greatest punishment of pain isn't that it hurts. It's when no one wants to listen. And you know what else? I receive letters from Clarinia. Written in tiny, crooked handwriting, but filled with affection. She talks about school, about the drawings she's been doing, says she misses me. She writes in secret, I know that. Her mother probably doesn't even imagine. But I read every word as if receiving a rare gift. Because in that girl still lives the memory of the love I built. She, unlike the adults around her, hasn't yet learned to disguise her affection. And that gives me hope. It reminds me that, even when the tree is pruned, the roots remain alive. Receiving these letters doesn't just move me, it strengthens me. They're like secret notes that tell me, you still matter to someone. And that's what every human being needs in the end, to know they matter. That, despite everything, someone still remembers, still loves, still wants to listen. Returning to living in peace wasn't a sudden miracle. It was a process. A new beginning. A rebirth. Little by little, I regained the sparkle in my eyes, the firmness in my hands, the confidence in my voice. I began to look at myself in the mirror without guilt. I began to walk down the street without fear of taking up space. I began to cook again as if it were a gift, not an obligation. And this kind of transformation is ageless. It begins when you choose to leave behind the places where you're being erased and place yourself where you can flourish. And it's curious how, when you change from within, the world seems to start spinning differently. Doors that were once closed, wide open, now become portals to new possibilities. Faces that once ignored you are replaced by faces that smile back. And loneliness, which was once a burden, transforms into solitude, a space to reconnect with yourself. A breath of fresh air. A relief. A peace that no longer depends on others, but on you. But life, with its irony and mysterious twists, never leaves a story without a turning point. Just when I was starting to think everything had settled down, he appeared. It was a Wednesday, around 10 in the morning. The sky was clear, a serene blue, and I was hanging clothes on the line. Dona Alice had gone out to run errands. I stayed behind to take care of the house, as usual. I heard the gate slowly slam shut. I didn't think it was anything serious. Maybe the neighbor, maybe a delivery. But when I looked over the wall, I saw that face I knew so well, but which now gave me butterflies. It was Renato. Standing there, his shoulders slumped, holding his cap in his hands like a courageless boy. He was no longer the haughty son who ignored my gaze at dinner. He was a different man. Aged. Tired. But what caught my attention wasn't his face. It was his silence. That same silence that had hurt me for so long. Now it was his. He said nothing. Neither did I. I just watched. Waiting. Reading that gesture with the attention of someone who has suffered too much to accept empty words. Because sometimes what remains unsaid speaks louder. And there, in that moment frozen in time, I knew. Something had happened. It wasn't a casual visit. Nor a memorized apology. It was something bigger. Something that was yet to be revealed. At that moment I knew. I won. But it wasn't a victory like in the movies, with loud music and applause. It was silent. It was intimate. It was that feeling of redemption, of inner justice, of someone who had endured too much for too long, and, even without screaming, resisted. The image of Renato there, standing before me, with teary eyes and a choked voice, was a reflection of everything unresolved between us. He was no longer the man who allowed himself to be erased. There before me was the boy who, somewhere in life, had lost his way. And now he was trying to find his way back. He opened his mouth to speak, but it took him a moment. His eyes tried to reach me, but there was a weight in his gaze that I hadn't recognized before. It was guilt. And maybe regret. He took a deep breath, ran his hand over his face, and said softly, "Mom, Clarinia misses you. She won't stop asking about you. Come home." When he said, home, I knew it wasn't the same word anymore. That home where I'd been silenced, where I'd become a burden, where I'd had to hide my desires and my pain. It no longer existed for me. I smiled. Not ironically, but with the serenity of someone who has cried all they had to cry. And then I replied, "Go back. I've just arrived where I always wanted to be, somewhere I'm treated like a person." The words came out lightly, but with the strength of a lifetime contained within. It was as if, in saying them, I had ended a cycle of self-denial, of blind obedience, of one-sided love. Renato lowered his eyes. He didn't reply. And that silence, coming from someone who always had ready answers, was a revelation. He knew. He understood. Absence touched him in a way my presence never could. Sometimes, it's absence that teaches. And I said nothing more. I didn't need to. Because, for the first time in many years, I was in control of my own story. The journey to that moment was tough. It was full of invisible layers that no one but me knew. A backstage of emotions that forced me to rethink everything. My mindset, my choices, my own worth. It wasn't just a change of address. It was an emotional, moral, almost spiritual decision. And standing there, standing firm before him, without lowering my tone, without begging for affection, without asking for another chance. It was the culmination of a silent transformation that no one imagined I would be capable of experiencing. As he stood at the gate, I felt a mixture of pain and liberation. Because he was still my son. And as real as the hurt was, so was the love. But love doesn't justify abuse. Nor does it cancel out neglect. And I learned, the hard way, that love isn't enough when respect is lacking. He handed me a small box. He said it was a keepsake from Clarinia. A drawing, a letter, and a small packet of candy. I took it carefully. I held it like someone holding a piece of sweet memory amidst a bitter past. Clarinia's letter was as sweet as ever. She said she dreamed of visiting me, that she missed my stories and my cheese bread. Her words embraced me. But they didn't make me give in. Because as much as I still loved her with all my heart, I couldn't go back to a place where my voice was ignored. Where my every gesture was controlled, my every step measured. The impact on my body, on my soul, was too profound to be erased with an apology. And in that moment, I realized that time teaches us things that love alone cannot. Renato said he was willing to change. That things at home weren't the same anymore. That Patricia was calmer, that Clarinia was sadder. He spoke as if trying to drag the past back with his bare hands. But I wasn't the same anymore. And sometimes, when we truly change, it's not the other person who needs to change to deserve you. It's you who finally understands that you no longer need to be deserved. That you're enough. That you've done enough. I don't know how long we stood there, in that back and forth of short words, carefully spoken phrases, and heavy silences. But I know that when he said goodbye, there was something different in his eyes. A kind of respect I'd never seen before. And it wasn't because I'd shouted, nor because I'd asserted myself. It was because, for the first time, I stood up. I walked back inside slowly, my heart at peace. The sun was already beating down on the backyard. I sat in Dona Alice's rocking chair, read Clarinha's letter again, and closed my eyes. I took a deep breath. And smiled again. Because, even with everything I'd lost, I finally had something not everyone can regain. My identity. My voice. My choice. And knowing this, knowing that even after so much silence, I was able to speak, to decide, to speak out, was what gave me the most strength to face what was yet to come. Because every journey has its surprises. And some revelations, even when they come late, still have the power to change everything. Life. Oh, it always finds a way to show who really deserves applause. And I, who for so long grew accustomed to the backstage, to the dark corners of the house, to the uncomfortable silences of those who pretend you're not there, today understand that my story, with all its scars, falls, and new beginnings, is worthy of the stage. Because there are things we experience that only those who have been through them understand. And when we survive, it's almost like being born again, but with more strength, more clarity, more courage. It took me a while to realize that what hurt me so much wasn't just the contempt, but the way I shrank to fit into others' expectations. I accepted little because I thought I deserved less. I kept quiet because I confused love with obedience. I smiled to keep the peace, even when the war was raging inside me. But there comes a point where the body can handle it, but the soul screams. And when the soul screams, I can no longer pretend everything is okay. I learned, little by little, that dignity isn't negotiable. That affection can't come with a rulebook. And that those who truly love you don't send you to wash clothes in the sink so as not to disrupt the laundry flow. Those who truly love you make room for you, not just in the closet, but in your heart, in your listening ear, in your time. Because true love doesn't diminish. It doesn't control. It doesn't turn you into a shadow within your own life. And look, if you're listening to this right now and feel like you've been living on the margins, if you've been holding back tears so as not to be a burden to anyone, if you've been apologizing for existing, take a deep breath. Because there's still time. There's still time to turn the key, to make new choices, to change course. It doesn't matter how old you are, how many times you've been disappointed, or how many people say, it's too late. As long as there's a shred of awareness, there's a chance to start over. And a new beginning doesn't have to be grand or flashy. It can be quiet, like mine was. It can begin with a saved coin, an embroidered dish towel, a sincere conversation with an old friend. It can begin with a whispered no, a small suitcase, a letter received. The important thing is that it begins. Because when we take the first step, the world around us notices. And little by little, things change. Because the energy changes. The vibration changes. The posture changes. And those who previously ignored you begin to see you differently. Today I can say with confidence, I don't regret leaving. I only regret taking so long to realize I deserved more. More respect. More listening. More space. And not just for being a mother, for being a grandmother, for having a story, but for being human. For existing. For having a voice. Looking back, I see that all the pain I experienced was also a lesson. And every tear I hid behind the stove, every night I slept with a heavy heart, every time I was called a nuisance, with words disguised as kindness. All of it shaped me, taught me, made me stronger. Because there are truths we only discover when we're thrown into the deep end. And there, where no one sees, we dig with our hands for what's left of you. And we find it. We always find it. Even if it's a small, dirty, forgotten piece. That's where the rebuilding begins. Mine began like this. Stumbling. With fear. But with an immense desire to be free. Not only from the people who erased me, but from the version of myself that accepted living erased. And that was the biggest turning point in my life. Realizing that the most important applause doesn't come from outside. It comes from within. When you can look in the mirror and even with wrinkles, with marks, with everything you've experienced, say, I like who I've become. And if I can leave you with one last thing to take away, it's this: those who see you as a burden will never understand the value of your presence. Don't insist on fitting in where you're not welcome. Don't ask for crumbs where banquets have already been served. Life is too short to waste trying to prove your worth to those who will never see it. And you know what's most beautiful? It's that when you finally put yourself where you deserve to be, the universe responds. New people appear. Opportunities arise. The air changes. Because you've changed. Because you stopped chasing closed doors and started building your own home, even if it's in someone else's backyard, with a room all to yourself, dish towels hanging, and a kettle sizzling on the stove. And it was then, right at this point in the journey, that something unexpected happened. Something I could never have predicted. But something that changed everything once again. If you've made it this far, it's because something in this story touched you in some way. And look, that already tells me a lot about your heart. So if this video made you reflect, if you felt like you walked with me through every part of this journey, leave a comment saying, I'm with you until the end. It will be beautiful to see those who also carry this hidden pain, but still choose to move forward with dignity. And if this kind of content resonates with you, if hearing real, human stories, with twists and turns and truths that aren't always told, helps you see things differently, subscribe to the channel. Because it's for people like you that I insist on continuing. Also, take the opportunity to leave your like, because when you do that, you show YouTube that this type of content has value, and it starts to reach more people who, perhaps, need the same message right now. There's a video here on the side that complements this subject. Click and continue with me there. The conversation isn't over yet.